The security app on my phone buzzed at 11:47 on a Tuesday night while I sat propped up in my son's guest bedroom with a fresh hip replacement and nothing better to do than watch 4 motion-activated cameras I'd installed around a cabin nobody in my family was supposed to know existed. I opened the notification, expecting a raccoon on the porch again. Instead, I watched my own son crouch at my own back door with a tension wrench in his hand, working the lock like a man who'd practiced the motion in his bathroom mirror. My name is Emmett Sokoloff. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a session guitarist and later a custom luthier in Nashville, and I built a small cabin on a quiet arm of Center Hill Lake almost 18 years ago that not one member of my living family knew belonged to me. I want to walk you through exactly how a man ends up watching his own son try to break into a house he doesn't know his father owns, because it didn't happen by accident, and by the time I understood what Bradley and Kayla were actually planning, I'd already decided exactly how I was going to handle it. Let me take you back further than the cameras, because the reason that cabin existed anonymously in the first place matters more than anything that happened the night of the break-in. I came up through the Nashville session scene in the late 80s, played guitar on records you've heard, even if you never learned my name, which is mostly how session work goes. You're the invisible architecture behind somebody else's voice. By my late 20s, I was touring occasionally with a moderately famous country act, filling in on lead guitar for 18 months while their regular player recovered from surgery. And that stretch of visibility is where the trouble started. A woman began showing up at shows, then at the studio, then, eventually, at my apartment building, convinced through some private logic I never fully understood that we were secretly engaged. It went on for the better part of 2 years. Restraining orders, a broken window, a letter campaign to my neighbors accusing me of things I won't repeat. The band's management eventually got involved, private security got involved, and I came out the other side of it a fundamentally more private man than I'd been going in. I stopped putting my name on anything I didn't absolutely have to. Real estate especially. When I bought that cabin on Center Hill Lake in my mid-40s, I did it through an LLC called Whisper Ridge Holdings, registered through an attorney's office in Murfreesboro, with a registered agent listed instead of my own name on any public document. Nobody had to know. That was the entire point. My wife Rosalind knew, of course. She helped me pick the property, actually drove out with me on a rainy April Saturday to look at 11 acres of scrub pine and lake frontage that the listing photos made look considerably less promising than it turned out to be. She's the one who saw the good bones in it, same as she saw good bones in most things, including, I've always believed in me. We built it slowly over 3 years, did most of the interior work ourselves on weekends, and it became the place we went when Nashville got too loud, when the sessions were piled up, when we just needed 4 walls that nobody else's expectations lived inside of. Rosalind taught high school biology for 26 years, the kind of teacher who kept in touch with former students decades after they graduated, who could tell you the migratory patterns of 6 different bird species without opening a book, and who brought that same patient, careful attention to the cabin that she brought to everything else in her life. She's the one who insisted we plant native grasses along the shoreline instead of sod, the one who spent an entire October weekend on her knees identifying which trees needed thinning and which needed protecting, the one who hung a hand-painted sign by the front door that just said "slow down," because she said Nashville had taught both of us to move at a pace no lake was ever built to accommodate. I still haven't taken that sign down. I don't imagine I ever will. Rosalind passed 6 years ago, ovarian cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the end, and her last good month, the month before the pain got bad enough that she needed to be closer to her doctors, we spent almost entirely at that cabin, sitting on the dock most evenings watching the light change on the water. I scattered some of her ashes off that same dock the following spring. That cabin isn't just a piece of real estate to me. It's the last place I got to be fully, uncomplicatedly happy with my wife, and the place I still go, more often than my kids realize, to remember what that felt like. I have 2 children. My daughter Priya lives in Asheville, runs a small physical therapy practice, calls me every Sunday without fail, and has never once in 34 years given me a reason to doubt where her heart sits. She was the kind of kid who did her homework without being asked and somehow still had time left over to worry about whether I was eating properly during long recording sessions, a habit that apparently never left her. Since she still texts me photos of vegetables she's convinced I should be eating more of. My son Bradley is 38, married to a woman named Kayla for 9 years. And for most of his adult life, I've watched him chase a version of success that always seemed to be exactly one bad decision behind him. Bradley was never lazy, and I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to tell this story and let people assume he simply didn't try hard enough. He tried constantly, at nearly everything. A landscaping business in his 20s that collapsed when his one major client went bankrupt, owing him $11,000. A stint reselling vintage furniture that did well for about a year before the market shifted under him. A brief and expensive flirtation with day trading that Rosalind, God rest her, talked him out of before it did any lasting damage. Every failure chipped something away from him, and I watched it happen from close enough to feel every chip, without ever quite finding the right words to stop the pattern before it repeated itself again. He and Kayla opened a restaurant 4 years ago, a modern Southern concept downtown that got a nice write-up in the local paper and folded within 18 months, leaving behind a pile of debt neither of them has fully climbed out from under. I helped them twice with money in those early years. Real help, tens of thousands of dollars each time. And I stopped after the second time, not out of cruelty, but because Rosalind used to say that some people don't need a rescue, they need a floor to finally hit, and I started to believe she was right about Bradley specifically. That decision, made 2 years before any of this happened, is probably where the resentment that led to my back door started actually growing, though I didn't understand that yet the night I watched him on my security app. I broke my hip in a fall off a ladder, cleaning gutters in my own house, 63 years old, and still too stubborn to hire it out, a fact my daughter has never let me forget since. Surgery went fine, but recovery meant I couldn't manage stairs alone for a few weeks, and Bradley, to his credit, was the one who offered his guest room without hesitation. I want to be fair here. Whatever else this story is about, Bradley did genuinely step up in that specific moment, and some small part of me still holds on to that when I think about everything that came after. It was during that recovery, laid up in his guest room, that the whole thing started, innocently enough, the way these things usually do. I'd asked Bradley to grab a folder of paperwork from my house, insurance documents, mostly for a follow-up claim on surgery, and in gathering it up he apparently also grabbed a stack of mail I'd left sitting on my kitchen counter, mail I hadn't yet sorted before the fall sent me to the hospital instead. Buried in that stack was a property tax notice from DeKalb County, addressed to Whisper Ridge Holdings LLC, care of a registered agent's office in Murfreesboro. Bradley told me later, once everything had come out into the open, that he almost didn't think twice about it, assumed it was misdelivered mail meant for someone else on my street. Except he glanced at the return address a second time and noticed the property parcel listed matched a lake address he didn't recognize, and something about it, he said, itched at him. Here's where I need you to understand something about my son that took me entirely too long to fully understand myself. Bradley isn't stupid. He's actually quite sharp, sharper than a restaurant failure or the debt would suggest. And when something itches at him, he has always had a talent for pulling on that thread until it unravels something. He didn't ask me about the notice. That's the detail that still sits heaviest with me, looking back. He had a father recovering from surgery 20 feet down the hallway, and instead of walking into that guest room and simply asking, "Hey Dad, what's this LLC thing that came in your mail?" he took the notice home, sat down with Kayla at their kitchen table, and started digging on his own. What they found, over the following 2 weeks, was a property parcel on Center Hill Lake, 11 acres, a modest cabin, owned by an LLC with no public officer listed, registered through an attorney's office that, when Kayla called pretending to be a prospective buyer's assistant, gave her nothing beyond confirming the registered agent existed. No name, no forwarding information, just a wall of professional discretion doing exactly what I'd paid it to do 15 years earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with my own son ever needing to be kept out. Bradley and Kayla, drowning in restaurant debt, staring down a second mortgage payment that was already 30 days late, apparently decided between the two of them that this had to be some forgotten family property, a great-uncle's place, maybe, something tangled up in an old estate that nobody had properly settled, sitting there empty and unclaimed while equity in a lake house quietly appreciated. Kayla, I learned later, was the one who pushed hardest once the idea took hold. Bradley wanted to make a few calls first, try to track down whoever actually owned it through more legitimate channels. Kayla's argument, according to Bradley himself when it all finally surfaced, was considerably more direct. If nobody's claimed it in this long, it's basically abandoned. We go look at it ourselves before we go through lawyers and give somebody a reason to lock us out of whatever's actually there. I didn't know any of this yet, of course, lying in that guest room with my hip healing and absolutely no idea my own son had my property tax notice sitting on his kitchen table. What I did know, 2 weeks into my recovery, was that my security app pinged with unusual frequency that particular Tuesday. First a vehicle motion alert at the end of my long gravel driveway around 11:20. Then a person detected alert at the back porch camera at 11:41. Then, at 11:47, the alert that actually made me sit fully upright in that unfamiliar guest bed. Hit protest be damned. I opened the live feed. Grainy night vision footage, but unmistakable even in that quality. My son, Bradley, crouched at my back door, a small tension wrench and a pick working the deadbolt with a patience that told me this wasn't his first attempt at something like this, while a second figure, taller, clearly Kayla, stood a few feet back, phone flashlight cupped low against the ground, watching the tree line rather than helping with the lock. I sat there in the dark of my son's own guest room and watched my son try to break into my house. I want to describe the specific, layered strangeness of that experience, because it isn't like any other kind of shock. There's the immediate, animal alarm of watching an intruder on a security feed, the same jolt anyone would feel. Then, almost simultaneously, the recognition, slower and stranger, of exactly whose face that was in the grainy porch light. And then, right behind the recognition, a third thing, quieter and colder than either of the first two, the understanding that whatever my son thought he was doing, he clearly believed there was nobody on the other side of that door who could recognize him. He wasn't robbing a stranger's house with his guard up against being seen. He was moving with the loose, unhurried confidence of a man who was certain the place was empty and would stay that way. I remember reaching for the lamp on the nightstand and stopping myself, some instinct telling me the light spilling under the guest room door might wake Bradley or Kayla down the hall and in the feed before I understood what I was actually watching. So I sat there in the dark, phone screen the only light in the room, my own heartbeat loud enough in my ears that I could hear over the quiet hum of the guest room's window unit. I thought, absurdly, of every version of Bradley I'd watched grow up in that same porch light years earlier. Sneaking back in past curfew at 17 with considerably less skill than he was currently demonstrating on my deadbolt, carrying Rosalind's groceries up that same gravel driveway the summer he turned 20, standing right about where he now crouched, the day we finished pouring the dock footings, grinning and covered in concrete dust, all of it layered underneath the grainy image of him picking my lock. Two versions of the same young man, occupying the same physical space, 18 years apart. I didn't call the police. I want to be honest about the several seconds I spent seriously considering it, phone literally in my hand, before I set it back down and made a different decision entirely. Whatever Bradley thought he was doing, calling a squad car out to arrest my own son in the dark, on a night I couldn't even get out of bed to be present for, felt like exactly the kind of overcorrection that would solve one problem while creating 6 worse ones. I wanted to understand what I was actually looking at before I decided how large a response it deserved. So I did something else instead. I called my attorney, a sharp, unflappable woman named Corinne Beasley, who'd handled the Whisper Ridge Holdings paperwork from the very beginning and had, over 15 years, become something closer to a trusted friend than a service provider. It was nearly midnight. She picked up on the second ring anyway, the specific mark of an attorney who's used to clients only calling her at reasonable hours when nothing important is actually happening. Emmett, it's midnight. Corinne, I need you to watch something with me right now. I forwarded her the live feed link. There was a long pause on her end while she pulled it up. Longer still once she understood what she was looking at. Is that Bradley? That's Bradley. Another pause. Emmett, do you want me calling the sheriff's department right now, this second? Because I absolutely will. No, I said. Not yet. I want eyes on this. I want it documented properly, and I want to understand exactly what he thinks he's doing before either of us decides what happens next. Corinne, God bless her thoroughness, was already one step ahead of me. The system's recording continuously, correct? Cloud backup, not just local storage. Cloud backup, yes. Good. Then let it run. Don't intervene tonight. We'll have a complete record, time-stamped, professionally stored, and we'll decide the actual response with clear heads instead of the hip replacement patient's midnight adrenaline making the call. I appreciated, Not for the first time. Exactly why I trusted this woman with my affairs for a decade and a half. I watched the rest of it unfold over the following 40 minutes, unable to look away, unable to do anything but document. Bradley got the deadbolt open around midnight, and the two of them moved through my cabin room by room with their phone flashlights, Kayla narrating quietly for what I'd later learn was a video she was recording on her own phone, a private inventory, essentially cataloging the contents of a house she believed belonged to nobody. I watched her flashlight pass across Rosalind's reading chair by the front window, across the bookshelf where I still keep every guitar magazine my wife ever teased me for saving, across the small collection of driftwood she used to gather off the shoreline and arrange along the mantel with the same careful eye she brought to everything else in her life. I watched my son's flashlight linger on my workbench in the back room, where I still build the occasional custom guitar body, tools laid out in the exact configuration I've used for 20 years. And I heard him say, muffled but audible through the camera's microphone, someone's clearly been using this place recently. Look at this workshop. At one point, Kayla's flashlight swept across the small side table, where I keep a framed photograph of Rosalind from the summer we finished the dock, and I watched her pause on it just a beat longer than she paused on anything else in the room, long enough that I wondered, watching from 100 miles away, whether some instinct in her recognized something about that photograph that her conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. Then the light moved on, and whatever flicker of recognition might have passed through her never surfaced out loud. Kayla's response came back sharp and immediate when Bradley mentioned the workshop. Doesn't matter. Squatters, caretaker, whoever. If there's no name on the deed we can find, it's fair game to at least look into. We're not taking anything tonight, Brad. We're just looking. They left a little after 1 in the morning, having taken nothing, having disturbed remarkably little, careful in the way of people who intend to come back. That carefulness, more than almost anything else that night, told me this wasn't an impulsive decision. This was reconnaissance. I didn't sleep the rest of that night, hip aching, mind running through 18 years of cabins worth of memory alongside 40 minutes of watching my own son's flashlight move across it like an appraiser's. Corinne called me back first thing the next morning. I did some quiet digging overnight, she said. Bradley made 2 calls yesterday afternoon to real estate attorneys in the DeKalb County area, both consultations about establishing ownership of an unclaimed or abandoned property, both under his own name. He's not being subtle about it once he's off your property, which tells me he genuinely doesn't think there's any risk in being straightforward about his intentions with a lawyer. He believes, completely, that this is genuinely unclaimed. I sat with that for a long moment. He's building toward an adverse possession claim, I said slowly, working through the legal shape of it, even through my own exhaustion. Adverse possession, occupying a piece of land openly and continuously long enough, under certain conditions, to eventually claim legal title to it, even against the wishes of whoever actually holds the deed. Tennessee's statute runs 7 years with color of title, 20 without. Bradley wasn't planning to just walk in and sell my cabin. He was planning something slower and, in its own way, more calculated. Establish a presence, document the apparent abandonment, and lay the legal groundwork to eventually make a real claim on a property he had absolutely no idea belonged to his own father. There's something else, Corinne said, and I could hear in her voice that this was the part she'd been building up to. One of the attorneys he consulted mentioned him, referencing a specific dollar figure. He apparently asked directly what a lake property of that approximate size and frontage might be worth on the current market, fully renovated versus as is. Emmett, he's not doing this out of curiosity. He's doing this because he and Kayla need money, and they think they found a legal, if slow, way to get it without asking you directly again. That last detail landed harder than anything else in the entire conversation. Not the break-in itself, not the reconnaissance, not even the adverse possession scheme. The fact that my son, rather than coming to me one more time, however uncomfortable that conversation might have been, had instead spent 2 weeks quietly building a legal case to take something from a stranger he assumed had abandoned it, told me exactly how far the asking had already worn thin between us. He hadn't wanted to ask his father for help a 3rd time. He'd rather steal from someone he thought didn't exist. I spent the better part of a week deciding how to handle it, still recovering, still in Bradley's guest room most of that time, which made the whole situation considerably stranger than it would have been under any other roof. I sat across the dinner table from my son and daughter-in-law 3 separate nights that week, ate the meals Kayla cooked, thanked her for her hospitality, and said absolutely nothing about the 40 minutes of footage sitting on a secure cloud server with my attorney's name attached to it. I want to be honest about how difficult that was. Not because I was tempted to blow up at them across a plate of pot roast, but because I kept watching my son laugh at something on the television, kept watching him refill my water glass without being asked, the same small, genuine kindnesses he'd shown me since the day I moved into that guest room, and I kept trying to reconcile that version of Bradley with the one I'd watched pick a lock in Grainy Night Vision. Both versions were real. That was the hardest part to sit with. One of those nights, Bradley sat down beside my recliner after Kayla had gone up to bed and asked, apropos of nothing, whether I remembered teaching him to change a guitar string when he was 9 years old, patient as anything, letting him mess up the winding for separate times before he finally got it right. I told him I remember it clearly. He said he'd been thinking about it a lot that week, though he didn't say why, and I sat there nodding along, already knowing exactly why, unable to say a single word about it. I've turned that particular conversation over in my head more than almost any other moment from that whole strange week, wondering whether some part of him already sensed the reckoning coming and was trying, in his own quiet way, to remind me of a version of himself worth forgiving before I found out everything else. Priya called that Thursday. Our regular Sunday call moved up because she'd heard through Kayla, in passing, that I was staying with Bradley during recovery and wanted to check in directly. I almost told her everything right then. I didn't. Not yet. Mostly because I hadn't fully decided what I wanted to do about it and didn't want to drag her into a decision I hadn't made myself. But something in my voice must have carried more than I intended, because near the end of the call she asked, quietly, "Dad, is everything actually okay over there?" I told her I was just tired from the recovery. She let it go, the way daughters sometimes do when they've decided to trust you even when their instincts are telling them something's off, and I hung up feeling worse about the omission than I had about almost anything else that week. I decided, finally, on the following Saturday, that I wasn't going to let this resolve itself through a courtroom, an arrest, or a screaming match across a dinner table. I wanted a specific, controlled reckoning, the kind that would make absolutely certain Bradley understood exactly what he'd done and exactly what it had cost, without destroying whatever relationship might still be salvageable underneath the wreckage. I called Corinne and laid out what I wanted. "I want to meet them there," I said, "at the cabin. I want to walk in the front door myself in front of both of them, and I want you there with the footage ready if I need it, but I don't want to lead with it. I want to give Bradley the chance to tell me the truth himself first." Corinne was quiet a moment. "That's a generous instinct, Emmett, for a man who watched his own son pick a lock 2 weeks ago." "He's still my son," I said. "I want to know if there's still a man in there who'll tell me the truth when it's just the two of us and nothing to hide behind." I told Bradley that Sunday morning that I felt strong enough to check on a property of mine out near Center Hill Lake, and asked if he'd drive me, since I still wasn't cleared for long stretches behind the wheel myself. I watched his face very closely when I said the words Center Hill Lake. Something flickered there, fast, gone almost before I could be sure I'd seen it. "Sure, Dad," he said. "Whose property is it?" "Mine," I said simply, watching him even more closely now. "Has been for about 18 years. I watched the blood actually leave his face in real time, watched him reach for his coffee mug and miss the handle on the first try." Kayla, standing at the kitchen counter, went very still. The drive out took 40 minutes, mostly silent, Bradley's knuckles pale on the steering wheel the entire way. I didn't say anything else. I wanted him to sit with it, to run through every possible version of what I might already know, to arrive at that cabin already unraveling before I said another word. When we pulled up the gravel driveway, I watched him take in the property with completely different eyes than he'd apparently had 2 weeks earlier. Not an abandoned parcel worth investigating, but his father's front door, his father's workshop, his father's dead mother's chair visible through the front window. He put the car in park and just sat there, hands still on the wheel, staring straight ahead. "Dad." His voice came out smaller than I'd heard it since he was a teenager. "I need you to explain something to me first," I said, keeping my voice level controlled, the voice I've used for 3 decades to calm down panicking studio engineers on deadline. "And I need you to be completely honest, because I already know more than you think I do." I watched him close his eyes, take a breath, and I watched him decide, in that moment, whether to keep building on the lie or finally let it collapse. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. Since the night you picked my back door lock at 11:47, I said. I have 4 cameras out here, Bradley. I watched the whole thing, live, from your own guest room, with my hip barely 6 weeks out of surgery. His face went through several rapid stages of horror, in quick succession. You watched everything. The lock, the walkthrough, Kayla's inventory video, your call to the DeKalb County attorney about establishing a claim on an abandoned property. All of it, time-stamped, backed up, sitting with my attorney. I let that settle a moment before I continued. I want you to understand something clearly, son. I'm not here to have you arrested. If that were my intention, a sheriff's deputy would have been waiting in this driveway instead of me. I'm here because I want to understand how my own child ended up believing that breaking into a house was an easier conversation to have than asking his father one more direct question. Bradley put his head down against the steering wheel, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, and whatever composure he'd been holding on to for the drive out had completely given way. I couldn't ask you again, he said, voice cracking. After the restaurant, after you'd already helped twice, I couldn't stand asking my own father for money a third time. I felt like such a failure every time I had to say the words out loud. And then this tax notice showed up, this place nobody seemed to own, and it felt like, I don't know, Dad, it felt like maybe there was a way to fix things without having to look you in the eye and admit I'd failed again. So, instead you decided to steal from a stranger. I didn't think of it as stealing, he said, and I believed, watching his face, that he genuinely meant that, however little the distinction actually mattered. I thought it was abandoned. I thought I was being resourceful instead of just being a burden on you one more time. It was never abandoned, Bradley, I said quietly. Your mother and I built this place with our own hands. I scattered some of her ashes off that dock right there. I come out here more than you know, to remember what it felt like when she was still healthy enough to sit beside me and watch the water. You didn't find an abandoned house. You found the one place on earth I go to still feel close to her, and you and Kayla stood in it with your phone flashlights, cataloging what it might be worth. Kayla, silent until this point, finally spoke from the back seat, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. Mr. Sokoloff, I am so deeply sorry. I pushed for this. I want you to know that clearly, because Brad wanted to look into it through proper legal channels first, and I was the one who said we should just go look ourselves before we tipped anyone off. This was my idea more than his, and I own that completely. I appreciated the honesty, even that late in the process, even after everything. I believe you, I told her, but I want both of you to understand something. It doesn't actually matter, in the end, whose idea it was first. You're married. You made this decision together, executed it together, and you're going to live with the consequences of it together. That's not a punishment I'm handing down. That's just what marriage means. We sat in that driveway another 20 minutes, the 3 of us, while I laid out exactly what I needed to happen next, and exactly what wouldn't. I wasn't pressing charges. I made that clear immediately, because I watched real fear flash across both their faces the moment I mentioned the footage, and I didn't want that fear driving the rest of the conversation. But I also wasn't pretending this hadn't happened. Wasn't going to smooth it over with a stern lecture and a return to normal dinners the following week. Here's what happens now, I told them. First, Curran's going to draft a formal acknowledgement, signed by both of you, stating exactly what occurred here, for my records only, not for any court. I need it on paper, not because I plan to use it against you, but because I need to know you've said the truth out loud in a way that can't later get softened into a story about a simple misunderstanding. Bradley nodded slowly. Second, I'm restructuring my estate paperwork this week. Whisper Ridge Holdings and everything else under my name is going into a trust with very specific, very clear terms about how and when either of you inherits anything, terms that account for exactly what I watched happen on that camera footage. I'm not cutting you out, Bradley, but I am done being casual about what I leave unprotected. That's fair, he said quietly. Third, I continued, if you and Kayla need help with the restaurant debt, you're going to come to me directly, sit down at a table, and have the actual conversation, painful as it is, instead of ever again deciding it's easier to take something quietly than to ask for it honestly. I'd have helped you a third time, Bradley. I might have said no, but I'd have talked with you about it like a father, not found out from a security camera that my own son thought breaking a lock was the easier path. He started crying then, properly, the kind of crying a grown man does when something he's been avoiding finally catches up to him all at once. "I'm so ashamed, Dad." "Good," I said, not unkindly. "Shame's not always a bad thing. It's information. What you do with it from here is what actually matters." I got out of the car slowly, hip protesting the whole way, and walked up to my own front door for the first time in 6 weeks. I unlocked it myself, deadbolt intact, exactly as I'd left it, and I stood in the doorway a long moment looking at Rosalind's chair by the window, the driftwood on the mantel, the workbench in the back room, all of it undisturbed, all of it still entirely mine. Bradley and Kayla followed me, and slowly, quietly, like guests in a house they'd only recently understood they'd never actually had the right to enter uninvited. We sat in that living room the rest of the afternoon, the three of us, and I told them stories about Rosalind I'd never told either of my kids before. How she talked me through the entire foundation pour with a level and a legal pad because I'd been too nervous to trust the contractor's numbers. How she used to swim out to the dock's far post every single morning regardless of the water temperature. How her laugh used to carry clean across the water on quiet evenings loud enough that I could hear it from a workshop with the door shut. I told them about the hand-painted sign by the front door, the one that just says "slow down," and watched Bradley's face when I explained why it was still there, still exactly where she'd hung it, 6 years after she'd stopped being able to walk out to that dock herself. I told them about the last conversation she and I had on that dock, near the end, when she made me promise not to let the place go quiet after she was gone, not to let it become a museum instead of a home. I hadn't kept that promise especially well. I admitted to them both, hadn't brought anyone else out there in 6 years, hadn't let the place breathe with other people's voices the way she'd have wanted it to. Bradley listened to all of it with the particular attention of a man finally seeing his mother as a full person instead of just the parent he'd lost, and somewhere in the middle of that afternoon, I watched something shift in him, something that felt less like guilt and more like grief for a version of his mother he was only now getting to properly meet. Priya found out everything 2 days later, because I told her myself, in full, over a long phone call I'd been putting off out of some misguided instinct to protect Bradley's dignity, even after everything. Her reaction was sharper than mine had been in the moment, considerably angrier on my behalf, and it took me longer than I expected to talk her down from driving straight to Bradley's house to say something she'd regret. "He tried to steal your house, Dad. He tried to steal a house he thought belonged to nobody." I corrected gently. "That's not the same thing, even if it's not much better. How are you this calm about it?" "Because I spent a week watching him at dinner every night before I said a word," I told her. "And underneath everything he did wrong, I still recognize my son in there. That doesn't erase what happened. It just means I decided the response needed to actually fix something instead of just burning it all down." Priya was quiet a long moment. "I don't know if I'd have been that patient." "You've never needed to be," I said. "You've never once made me choose between being angry at you and loving you. Bradley's making me learn how to hold both at the same time. It's not a skill I asked for, but I suppose I have it now." It's been 8 months since that Sunday in the driveway. Bradley and Kayla are still working through the restaurant debt, slower than either of us would like, but honestly this time, with a monthly conversation the three of us have together instead of the silent, avoidant spiral that led to a lockpick in the first place. I did help them, eventually, with a portion of what remained, but structured as a loan this time, documented with actual terms because Rosalind was right all those years ago about floors and rescues, and I finally understood the difference wasn't in whether you helped, but in how honestly everyone involved was willing to talk about it. The trust paperwork went through Corin's office last spring, Whisper Ridge Holdings protected with terms specific enough that nothing like that Tuesday night could ever happen again without a great deal more legal effort than either of my children would likely have the stomach for. I still go out to the cabin most weekends, hip fully healed now. Guitar workshop exactly as I left it. Bradley's been out twice since that Sunday, always by invitation, always announced well in advance, and the second time he brought a level and a legal pad, an odd, quiet homage to a story about his mother he'd apparently thought about more than I realized, and helped me true up a section of dock railing that had started sagging. We didn't talk much while we worked. We didn't need to. Some repairs, to a dock and otherwise. Just take the steady, unglamorous work of showing up again and again until the thing finally holds the weight you're asking it to carry. Priya came out for the first time last month, her first visit to the place at all, and stood in the doorway a long moment, taking it all in before she said anything. "This is where you go," she said quietly, more statement than question. "This is where you actually are. All those Sundays you tell me you're just puttering around the house." I told her yes, this was where I actually was most Sundays, sitting on that same dock with a cup of coffee going cold, and I watched her eyes go a little wet looking at her mother's chair by the window, the driftwood on the mantel, the hand-painted sign by the door. "I wish I'd known sooner," she said. "I wish I could have come out here with you before now." "You're here now," I told her. "That's the part that actually matters." I think, 8 months out from that Sunday in the driveway, we're getting there. Slowly. Honestly. The way Rosalind would have wanted us to.